Hello everyone, today we talk about Eurasian steppes warfare and more specifically of Italians, Ottomans and Tartars during the 15th century. We have observed the Rus, the Pontic steppes in the more continental dimension in the last episodes. Today we introduce the topic looking a bit at also the 13th to 14th century, where these protagonists were coming from. In the areas of today's essentially Crimean, the ancient Chersonesus Taurica, So we're looking at this region and the adjacent lower reaches of the Don, the Dnieper, and the Dniester River. We have talked about the Italian maritime republics. We have talked about the Ottomans. About the Tartars, about other neighboring powers. We've seen the Caucasus, we've seen from the other side of the Black Sea, Moldova. We have followed also, of course, the main struggle going on there between the Byzantines and the Seljuks in the south, in Anatolia. So this is a quite complex system that was actually changing in a very intertwined way, that especially in the 13th and the 14th centuries saw major alterations of the system, also for these other powers to essentially take root in the area. We have seen how by the 13th century this northern shores of the Black Sea had basically been included into the sphere of influence of the Cuman nomads that fundamentally acted as a sort of client power, sometimes allied, sometimes actually enemy of the Kievan Rus. From the other side in the south, the Byzantine Empire, in spite of its misfortunes during the 13th century, still had a substantial influence and contact with the Rus. And beyond. You know that during the Fourth Crusade, the Venetians and the French fundamentally take over Constantinople, which is practically becoming the center of a new feudal empire in the Balkans that, however, is significantly crippled as soon as it began. I made a video about the Latin Empire, mostly, in fact, the continental dimension is lost. The Venetians maintained the islands, though, and with that, the upper hand, especially from the sea, on the entire, in fact, eastern Mediterranean traffics. The Genoese, their historical rivals, however, were sponsoring the Paleologoid dynasty that had taken refuge after the fall of Constantinople. In Asia, in Anatolia, with the capital of Nicaea, and that began to subcontract to their Italian allies entire, in fact, Aegean islands, and also eventually with the recapture of Constantinople by the Byzantines in the same century, even the crossing of the Bosphorus. And so the opening to the Black Sea. It doesn't matter how the Genoese were becoming secondary ever since especially Venice had allied herself with the Catalonians that also had a presence, as you know, in these regions, with especially the mercenary company of Roger de Flor and so on. So that tells you more or less how, roaming the many, say, at least players coming from the west looked across these seas especially, and how much formerly owned Byzantine power they had seized. With the 14th century, there is, as you know, a ferocious crisis that, however, affects relatively, at least the strength ratio. The Italians control the sea. The Byzantine Empire is basically just sitting there. And in the east, in Anatolia, the Osmanian dynasty of Turks that inhabited just on the Asian side of the Marmara Sea had started consolidating an important power, right? Together with other Turkic populations and other Mordirs, etc., they had mostly also taken the seas, occupied some valleys that had been previously just held by the Byzantines, and harassing the system, right? To become, however, only the 15th century the consistent threat, right? That we know of, right? And actually, we have seen in the videos about the rise of the Ottomans how this escalade was quick, right, and somewhat unexpected, right? Just a few decades before the fall of Constantinople, there was nothing deterministic about the rise of the Ottoman Empire as such. This fresh force was capitalizing upon the same Byzantine failures, in a sense, especially in front of the West, that was very present, as we have observed, and that in the end, in the struggle, right, for the control of the Balkans, actually preferred to side with the Ottomans rather than with the Westerners, essentially allowing the Turks to establish themselves successful, right? And by the time of the invasion of Timur the Great, it would have taken just the Venetians or the Knights of St. John to simply crush the remnants of the Ottomans. Instead, these were sponsored against the Saint Tatars and the Saint Timurids to a point of essentially putting them back on their feet. Right? In perspective, naturally, one could say, well, we know it now how the things have gone. But if you look at the political scenery at that point, it was also, a sound thing to do, because the predictability of this phenomena was, impossible, right? Just as it's mostly impossible to predict today what would happen in 4 months, right? Just per se, with a degree that would be satisfactory for market investment, right? And so it was at the time. It's a very complex history. The Ottomans, as you know, emerged basically from the at least what had been the domains of the Sultanate of Rome, that was in turn like basically an offspring of the Seljuk Sultanate in Asia Minor, and that in the 13th century had even managed to size up the Taurica, the Crimea. Right. This was done, in an uncoordinated way. Right. The Sultanate of Rome was particularly fragmented. The center revolved around the Conquest, as you know. But these other, Turkic lordships could practically infiltrate throughout this pretty softened up scenario, especially after the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. Right. It was a major at the beginning of the 13th century, major game changer. It basically privatized. It was a disaster for the region, because it simply, together with the Byzantine state, everything that was working in terms of the few that had remained of public culture and some kind of less broader deterrent was over. Like, lots of people began immediately to devour this carcass that the Latins were trying to keep alive in their own way. And so this goes in parallel, especially during the 14th century crisis, with the general, again, fragmentation, from one side contraction of these powers, but from the other probably the emergence of others, in an area where, you can't really think in the same way as you think in Western Europe. Like, Western Europe was already consolidating essentially a pre-modern kind of profile. There were very specific polities. They were evolving essentially on a statal, civil basis with very specific permanent institutions. If you look at the coasts of the Black Sea, you're in a completely different world, right? Where you can't find, again, wild nomads raiding, pillaging, no actual major central authority. Naturally, a much more sparse population, more difficult communications, and at the same time, a substantial amount of wealth that is now under the control of this kind of different powers that are, easier prey for those who had at least the control of the sea, so namely the Italians that were coming instead from that, in fact, western and kind of Statel-centered by this point power that was at its peak, together with the great medieval civilization, of course, especially between the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century. Right, Venice and Genoa bleed each other white during the 14th, which is a deep crisis. But again, those Italian ports remained, and they became a major feature of local warfare. Also opening, as we've seen, we've already seen the Western influence in the previous videos from the continental side. The last episode was about the Lithuanians, about the Rus, the Golden Horde. We've seen there were substantial Western, essentially like the emanation of the originally Frankish world, you can say, in medieval perspective, in terms of arms, armor, etc. The same is true for the Balkans. I made a video about Eastern Balkan warfare, arms and armor. The influence from Italy is very strong there. We know in Hungary, of course, the finest Milanese armor was imported. So you can find very interesting stuff going on, even far beyond that, right? In Anatolia, in the Black Sea, and in fact in these easternmost corners of Europe. Now, the place in itself is quite fascinating. And until the 13th century, Crimea was inhabited by an impressive amount of different peoples that, however, lived in a very peaceful fashion with one another. We're talking mostly about Byzantines, you can say Greeks, but by this point, Armenians, the Karaite Jews, that had come from, essentially, or was a sect originating in Mesopotamia. They weren't, say, Orthodox Jews. You know that the influence of the Khazar Khaganate, and especially its collapse, its diaspora, had brought some of those Jewish converts to the west. Right, some of the greatest cities in Central Eastern. If you look at Prague, Krakow, they were all, inhabited by Jewish communities that the local monarchs treasured, because they could allow the local trade to flourish and to centralize from the cities against the native oligarchy that was rolling backwards. Crimea, and we know this also from the late modern era anthropological reliefs in Loco, was inhabited by the gods, right? At least what we think was an actual reminiscence, if not properly, of the ancient, what we call, especially the Greutungi that had established, as you know, a kingdom there in late antiquity, but a consistent amount of Germanic population of Germanic ancestry and language, especially because that was properly a language spoken there. Called as Goth. You had still, we've seen it in the previous episodes, some people from Ossetia, right, that also styled themselves as Alanians still in historical legacy. There were Turks, as you've seen from these other steps, populations that had come at waves and to the point of ethnic indistinguishability as far as the various, in fact, Turkic powers were succeeding themselves. And the 13th century, again, mostly up to, again, as long as the Byzantine Empire had been working, and as you know, until essentially the second half of the 12th century, under the Komnenians, the empire reached a massive amount of power and prosperity to a degree that affected, in fact, also these colonies in the Black Sea. Were living in the local cities, villages. They grew wheat and grapes. They grazed sheep. They manufactured excellent pottery. They dried and smoked fish. They made wine, as the weather allows. And they traded, of course. And they hardly ever made war. This was an important aspect of the situation. And this is why also this area was being eyed by the Western merchants that were already present there but that would start colonizing properly, and as we will see now, after the Mongol hurricane that had invested these peoples, because everything changed by the mid 13th century. The Taurika became, at that point, a part of the Golden Horde's domains, and participated at that point, to this you can call cultural genesis, right, in the western area of the empire of the King Gizids. This was not necessarily a positive thing. Of course, the Golden Horde was installing itself, as we've seen, on already a pre-existing dimension that you can even date back to the Khazar times, aside from the environment of the steppes. But as we were seeing just in the video about 14th century Rus, Lithuanian, and in fact Mongol warfare in this area, it was gradually to give way to the sanitary world. Gradually, but these were the last centuries of prosperity of the steppes, especially the western ones, and the, say, great part of the Mongol grip on the surrounding peoples, on the tributaries, on the subjects, was imposed on still this, again, primitive, brutal, as archaic way of life that naturally an empire based mostly on the steppes, but admittedly not only. There were important centers. Think about Sarai and the Volga, the connections with the Caspian Sea, with Persia. It was an excellent position. It's the same one from which, again, the Mongols had tried to, at least, to test for an invasion of substantial part of Europe, north of the oil fields, like the pasture grounds north of the Caucasus. But it did say what happened in the hinterland, as far as the displacement, for example, of the Kumans, the substantial collapse of great part of what had been the Kievan Rus, the fact that the Byzantine Empire had also temporarily evaporated and now was just coming back like a relic of the older self. And all what this entailed, because there had been lots of Mongols that had been settling in some other areas and properly caused a true desertification in some cases. At least, some areas that had been once developed agriculturally, they were well irrigated with dams and so on. Now, by falling into the hands of the nomads, had changed phase dramatically. This had occurred to an important degree to the same Anatolia, as you know, after Manzikert and Myriokephalon, the latter also basically close to these events. So that this big last push from the steppes, directed by the Mongols, had shattered great part of the intense process of sedentarization that, as we've seen, had been happening already from quite a while, right? Already in Khazar times, and that was also accompanied naturally by the same crisis of the Mongol Empire, the Black Death, the depopulation, the shrinking of the properly of the worked lands, right? And this situation of precarious balance and collapse, especially of public authority, of more productive polities that accompanied it, right? We often do not picture the extent of the brutality of the steppes invaders, right? And that were doing things actually right their own way, meaning that they literally didn't have many other means to keep things under, if not by gradually settling down and becoming essentially whatever culture was already existing locally. But again, it's also a matter of method of documentation. You do not know what happened, say, in these. In fact, in the Pontic steppe by the 13th to 14th century, as much as you know what happens in France, what happens in Germany, or whatever. right? It's again a completely different world, and the voices, the witnesses, the experiences of lots and lots of people that were essentially massacred or died, of hunger, or were deported, God knows where, from the other side of Eurasia, right? Are completely lost for us, even just to appreciate the extent of the horror that this destruction in the first place had been causing, right? This naturally, again, was also the fault, admittedly, of the local population, or at least of how they reacted, or they coped with this. It was a fierce competition involved here, and everybody was trying to make their best for themselves. Now, gradually, the influence of Islamic Anatolia became the strongest in the area, right? This was already, an important regional dimension per se. That the Seljuks were strongly Persified by the time they settled in Asia Minor, but we often also underestimate how many peoples from, say, Kurds, Russians, other, peoples from Caucasus, and from further places that had technically also not much to do with the Turks, settled, right, in that melting pot. At the same time, as we were saying before, the Italian merchants from Genoa and Venice, having received the necessary authority from the Khans of the Golden Horde, set up in a number of the old centers their self-governed colonies with their own military forces. Right? The Italians exploited this political fragmentation. They had the largest naval power available, namely de facto permanent naval forces, because even though these were almost all privately owned, the republics would simply say, well, now we need some of these galleys to go colonize this place, or to make a raid on that other, to seize that citadel, whatever. And of course, the republics were run by the same people who owned these private companies. And this meant that basically the Italians could send the ships everywhere. They were hired famously by the Castilians, by the French. Under the Iberian authority, the Italian sailors opened the Atlantic routes, changing to, the world to a dimension that you evidently understand. And that thus were also historically habituated to do so, right? The Genoese reached as far as Black Africa, and during the High Middle Ages, they were really trading everything you could imagine. These the Italian centers made really lots of videos about this, were the ones that had been having uninterruptedly since the Roman times, throughout the early Middle Ages, etc., the higher per capita wealth in the world. They had been the ones who had been also mostly trading with China continentally, as far as the Mongol Empire had provided through the so-called Pax Mongolica, the crossing that now was basically fragmented instead by the local polities that had arisen after the disgregation of the Oceanic Empire. And so that now didn't have the problem, actually, to concentrate their great capitals that their banking system had managed to salvage in spite of the crisis of the countryside all over Europe. I made lots of videos about the peasantry, the collapse of peasantry income, like the strengthening exactly of this patrician oligarchic systems, right? And so also the statalization, like most of what we consider as modern, right? And think about the Italian Renaissance, the republics, the city-states, was actually being consolidated at this very point in terms of properly a unitary system. Admittedly, the Genoese that are the protagonists here were the ones who still retained some sort of more private institutional system to rule their colonies. Venice was much more unitary, but still by 14th, 15th century standards were by far some of the most civilly advanced polities in the globe. And they could, at this point, easily exploit this advantage, right? They were, after all, sought after by these same continental powers. That has always been the case with the Arabs, the same, any other power that existed in the Mediterranean that didn't have, because continentally that was not feasible, right? No country, again, had the capacity to maintain permanently a fleet, right? Mostly created one ad hoc, and then they let it rot or disband in some way. And at best began to hire these guys, and also as far as settling as merchants in their major ports and markets. The Italians would seize basically some quarters, they would fortify, entrench themselves in there. They were the only ones who could access the city from the sea, again, because they dominated the latter, and thus they could hardly be dislodged. But they were so important for connecting the entire economic world that even though they often quarreled against one another, they literally fought in the streets of these portual cities, destroying large amounts of them because of the rivalries between city and city, that the local powers could not really do much about that. They could maybe temporarily punish them for that mess. This had always been the back and forth with the Byzantine Empire, as you know, playing either on the Venetians, the Pisans, the Genoese. But at the end of the day, they needed some of them. They needed their markets, they needed their ships, connections, clienteles, and that's also how largely the same Byzantine Empire had collapsed, at least from, if you look at the military and the maritime dimension through which that had been possible, the fact that the Italian fleets had been substituting to the imperial ones, at least from the 11th to the 12th century. And now these forces were receiving, right, permission from the Golden Horde to occupy some lodgings in this important ports, as we've seen, the major Russian rivers in the east, through which an impressive amount of wealth came from. We're talking mostly about not just grain or timber, furs, whatever. We're talking also about slaves, right? Really a great quantity of them, as the Mongols had basically injected this kind of human trafficking style as far as this subversion, right, and eventual also collapse of the system had included. So it was all very remunerative. These were the same eras, just to make you picture what it means, from which the Egyptians imported their own Mamluks, right, from north or the same Caucasus. Well, most of those slaves, at least a consistent part of them, passed through Italian hands, and making an extraordinary amount of money. We're talking also about the finest, given we're talking military here, the finest Western forces you can find, au pair with the French ones at the time. Like the Italians, as we'll see now, have essentially, most famously, the most advanced arms and armor production. They are, together with the Mamluks, also the most advanced technological naval power. They really pioneer all this technical advancements of the time, in the same effect, sealing, but also in, for example, firearms, and so on. The Italian culture was thus implanted in the Crimea, right? Again, if you look at the Genoese colonies, well, there was a consistent Genoese presence up to the 19th, the 20th century in Crimea, historically, stemming from exactly this, the Middle Ages. And the mark that especially the Genoese left in terms of fortification in Crimea, I think it's very well known. I have uploaded pictures here of some of the most the largest fortifications, some of which are really massive things, in colonies such as Soldaya, Mod Sudak, that's a hell of a one, Kaffa, Fedosia, Tanais, Azov, Cembalo, Balaclava, Moncastro, You see the Italian names in there, here and there. The Belgorod-Dnestrovsiki. And together with that, the Italians brought the novelties of European weaponry that were in turn juxtaposed with the military inventions of the Golden Horde that we've seen in the previous episode, but also the ones of the broader Islamic East. Right? Again, we've seen also in the video about Eastern Balkan warfare how much Turkish influence already existed, say, even in the Byzantine panoply, right? I made a video about 14th century Byzantine cavalryman that speaks of that as well, and we will surely come back on that at some point, right? Now, given these hyper-strategic locations, the Italian colonies needed only a limited amount of soldiers to be garrisoned. You would have in these centers typically some dozens of highly paid European mercenaries, right, equipped like men-at-arms, right, in we will see now, of course, the evolution of armor during the 14th, 15th century. You switch basically from male prevalence to plate prevalence. And accompanying them as lighter troops, 100 or 200 what were known in Italy as Gazzari, that would have been Gazzarians, these Khazars probably, that were essentially local nomads, right? They not necessarily had to do with the Khazars ancestrally speaking, but as we were saying before, who the hell is able even to districate oneself about the genealogy of whichever group of these nomadic peoples, right, during the 13th and 14th century, their ancestry or whatever. They were basically all alike, and they all performed basically the same functions. So you understand it's not very different from the Crusades that now are over, but actually these Italian republics still own, even after the fall of the Ottoman states, the same ports, or the same quarters that they own, even before the Crusades started. So there's a deep continuity, even just in terms of, not just political practice, but the military influence that they could actually exercise, right? Back in the day, the Venetians were forbidden to export slaves and weapons to Egypt, just to make an example of that. We've seen in the videos about, especially the Ilkhanate, how Frankish mercenaries and Italian marines were employed by the Mongols of Persia in consistent numbers, right? So there was definitely, we know from the traveling diaries, from the general memories of the merchants. Again, fortunately at this time we start having really an overwhelming amount of documentation, at least in Western Europe, and we can trace literally the movements of these peoples, where they went, what they sold, what they traded in the first place, and that had definitely a lot to do with steel. The lighter troops in the East. Consider actually on the battlefields of Western Europe, especially in the 14th century, you have the fully armored armorization, we can say, of essentially what you call the men-at-arms. There is not a distinction anymore between the knight, let's say, and the squire, the follower, whomever, in terms of armament. Right, surely there are lighter troops towards in the 14th, 15th century, or start having more specialized troops. Sometimes they came from these countries. Think about the Stratiots in the Venetian army. Think about the Cumans, as they had been like for the Hungarians or for the Germans. Right, these lighter troops that are employed a bit of in different quantity, but at the end of the day perform all the same role. They're basically harassing the enemy, chasing, looting, pillaging, whatever, paving the way to this ever heavier men-at-arms, right? And especially if you are, again, an Italian, or maybe just a foreign mercenary, because the Italians paid lots of them at this point as well, in Gazzeria, as it was called. So imagine the open plains today, where the war is being fought today. You definitely need that cover in terms of maneuverability, speed, agility, etc., that these lighter troops only can give you, right? But the Italians don't even need to venture too much out there in the steppes. Actually, they do not give a damn about what happens in the hinterland. This had always been the case. Again, it's just like the Venetians with the Latins in Romania. They said, okay, all the land is yours. We just want the islands. We just want the ports. That's basically it. But just in case, and also because, of course, sieges would occur, would be the famous siege of Caffa, of Genoese held Caffa, that allegedly would be the one from which the ships with the plague that had been spreading in the settlement, because the Mongols trebucheted this putrefacted carcasses infected with the disease into the enemy place. Stronghold would eventually travel back to the Italian ports, and this would spread towards Europe, right? We do not have. We know that it spread like that. We do not know whether the accident is connected with the broader spread. It seems unlikely, that because that thing was spreading anyway. But surely it's that messed up sometimes what can happen locally, and the importance is just garrisoning those places with no further ambition of going inland, right? Because it was completely useless. Once you control the river mouth, the trade pass through there, essentially at the end of these branches of the Silk Road, was it. You just exacted the tolls. You had the actual permission from much less, say, financially thriving powers, like could be the Golden Horde. That's right. It's a nice subcontract where everybody's more or less satisfied and confident. Naturally, there is a degree also of aggression, right? Especially in amphibious operations, seizing certain settlements along the coast. Again, we do not even know much about the actual settlements, because some of them were even at some point submerged by the waters. You know that there are lots of marshes, swamps, again, rivers. The land is pretty flat. So we know that at some point in history there were some interesting markets, and the Italian portolani at this point give us a lot of interesting information, but sometimes we cannot locate them because they disappeared, right? Or they are out there, but nobody dug them. And so many of these places would be taken by force, also by some local, say, Mongol lords. You can imagine, of course, the Golden Horde also having a loose control, especially in the periphery that these coastlines represented. So it was a lot of action, at least as far as the local resources were could allow, right? Just somebody was bringing them from the outside, so it was different now. This Gazarians served also as mounted police. Again, all the brigands that could exist there, other Turco-Mongol kind of horsemen that could roam the areas, it would be chased by these lighter guys and headed by some men-at-arms, somebody that was in charge with a district policing, that stuff. I made multiple videos about Italian warfare during these centuries. So given that here there were no major pitched battles, at least in the ones you see in Italy and in other parts of Western Europe, I will not explain like the degree of advancement of the art of war that these people were bringing with them. But the equipment shall suffice, right? The Europeans were armed with crossbows, swords, halberds, bows, later with handguns and cannons. These were actually among the first powers to use that, at least in an effectively integrated fashion with the rest of what were becoming armed forces proper. We've seen that the Tartars of the Golden Horde had their own gunners and so on, but the level, especially of logistical, technical, naval expertise, the guns that are starting to be designed properly to be lodged on, on the ships and so on, are all things that are coming from the Mediterranean at that point. Only the highest official, the consul, the commander of armed forces, wore the full knight's armor panoply, right? In this regard, as we were saying before, there were some men-at-arms basically acting as the lords, literally, of the land, right? These consuls ruled over communities that were considered autonomous from the mother city, right? Which meant that they had their own customs locally, whatever. There were some, of course, laws that say instructed them on how to behave locally and so on, but in many ways, again, this land was so far away that the local consul was basically able to do largely whatever they want. This had already been evident in places like Crete, right? At some point there was a rebellion, sometimes even from the local fief holders. At some point, with the tightening grip of the central government, wanted to maintain their own, in fact, autonomy. This frontier here in the Black Sea is relatively more militarized, and also the centers are somewhat not necessarily smaller, but they tend to be more foreign, right? Wilder, some less compatible with properly the Western modus operandi, even more than what would be the case in the Mamluk Sultanate, that was actually quite advanced and civil power by Islamic standards, and also very, very Western influences, that just like the Ottomans would be later on. We'll see it now. Now, notoriously, I made so many videos about arms and armor of the medieval knight /men-at-arms, so you can find everything in the relative playlist. But to make the long story short, at least in the 14th century, the panoply consisted of mail, a cuirass of large, thick iron plates riveted on the inner side of a soft base covered with velvet or broadcloth, right? There were different styles, even fashions, typologies, materials used. Cuir appuyer was a thing, for example. Indeed, however, metal armor in the first place was becoming ever heavier in the first place, more articulated, and this again were the troops bringing from their homeland the highest, the most advanced technology available as far as arms and armor was concerned. Greaves, brassards, and gauntlets of steel and leather parts reinforced with metal completed this set of war gear. As we were saying, the main weapons of the nobility were naturally swords, spears, daggers, maces, and picks, all stuff that naturally had to smash violently into the single most armored opponents that largely at that point were the same Italians or other Westerners. But as we'll see now, also some surely Islamic men-at-arms that you can imagine. In the 15th century, the armor came to be notoriously and completely of steel, right? Firearms became widespread. Also, handguns, properly from the last decades of the 14th century, start making up like 1/3 of the Italian infantry forces. You find definitely an incredibly well-supplied system. Again, these guys not just had the technology, they had essentially a business model that made the thing work. I want to make a video about properly Milanese armor to make you understand how properly industrial the system looked like, right? There were other centers in arms and armor production were rising, for example, in southern Germany, but the level of business advancement, kind of the index, the sheer amount of wealth properly revolving around these heavily centralized and yet private companies in the sector was, again, the single most advanced in the world. And this armor was notoriously exported all over Europe, right? Basically, the prevalent one also during the Wars of the Roses. So this kind of were Italian imports. This was going on for quite a while, right? Even longbows were produced in Lombardy and exported to England in great quantities. And notice that the Italians kept using crossbows, even though they had longbows themselves at some point. So it's a great universe of military culture that I think pop culture has completely suppressed in favor of some sort of kind of darker, pauperistic and backwards view of the Middle Ages that doesn't match with the greatest advancements of Western civilization at that point, and that I will keep making videos on. By the way, if you're interested, I made something about the 15th century Venetian army organization. We talked about the Battle of Molinella, for example. You can look at the tactics employed at this point with first mobile artillery, things on the field, things like that, and all this stuff was brought in the East as well. So great presence, great income, but it's not enough, right? For the simple reason that doesn't matter how qualitative these naval powers really are on their own, their center is still in Europe. It's mostly regional, if not provincial, in nature. You know that Genoa, for example, doesn't quite have, aside from Corsica, and in fact parts of Crimea, the parts of Turkey, parts of along the coast, most doesn't have a continental dimension. So it's mostly what happens literally in Genoa and in surrounding cities, with France, with Milan, with Naples, etc. That makes the thing. And so when a major power, like it could be, Hungary for Venice, or even the Golden Horde at some point for Genoa, because as we've seen, the relations were not always cordial, let's say, wanted to dislodge the Italians, they could really make a concentrated fort with armies of the largest size at the time, basically 30,000, besieging the most fortified places and finally storming them, if they were lucky, because again, the odds of war are always, especially in those cases, pretty balanced. But at least those are the guys who hold the hinterland. So on the longer run, doesn't matter how long can these powers hold, if there is at least a compact power in the hinterland, things become a problem. And especially if this power begins to stretch across the sea, and especially the Aegean one. And so the only way through the Black Sea, from Italy in this case, we're talking about the Ottomans, we're talking about the Ottoman Empire. And so all the problems that this caused to the Italian presence in the Black Sea, in the Aegean, and essentially in the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole, right? So in 1475, the Crimean strongholds, both Italian and Gothic, telling the truth, they were still the gods around these centers, as well as the cities of the lower Don, the Dnieper and the Dniester rivers, were conquered, in fact, by a newly born giant, the Osmanian Empire. Right. The rise of the scene was very quick. I made lots of videos about this phase, let's say the rise of the Ottomans. We will keep talking about them. I made lots of videos about Ottoman warfare, exactly from these centuries, so to get an idea what it really was. You can check the relative playlist, you will find everything there. And this power began as we've seen, to take over essentially an exhausted system, as far especially as the Rumelia was concerned, like the Balkans, and eventually knocking out this major giant, literally, that was the Hungarian kingdom. On the longer run, in the 16th century, this power would take over Egypt, the entire Mamluk power was reduced essentially to a client state. The Ottomans began to essentially concentrate a vast amount of land and naval forces to take out the Christians of Cyprus, of Rhodes. They tried with Malta, but at least they failed. So you understand that here it was a bit more than having like the upper hand because of a general situation of instability like the one it had formed itself. Admittedly, the Italians and especially the combination of the Venetian and the Genoese fleet would de facto shelter the peninsula effectively from the Ottoman invasions, right? What happened in Otranto in Apulia was actually plotted by a coalition of anti-Neapolitan forces, including Florence and so on. So that's why the Ottomans could afford to do that. There were made videos about that, raids in northeastern Italy, passing through Croatia, as the Ottomans were launching them from Bosnia mostly. But again, the Mediterranean side was always pretty complicated. It would remain always so logistically until the 17th century. I made, as you know, a series about the siege of Vienna in 1683 that illustrates like the options that still the Ottomans historically had been having. Either you could invade Italy, and there you had basically to go first of all towards sea, or you could head towards Vienna, or even though it sounds pretty far away, even Warsaw at some point was they were undecided in 1683 actually between Vienna and Warsaw, but at least by the time they had already decided, but it was an option, right? The important thing though is that what happens in the Black Sea is closely related to the closure, obviously the closure of the Bosphorus by the Turkish conquest of Constantinople, and that's why among the few forces that intervened from the west to try to save the city, that was surely not so like it had to fall. It was like all the rhetoric of the Lost Coast, my eyes, right? The entire operation was incredibly bold and risky, and the Ottomans really sweat tears and spit blood in order to conquer a city whose gates were basically opened by the Greeks, that basically didn't want, in fact, the papacy. Right? They preferred literally Islamic domination to that, which in inside is not something positive, right? It's not an anti-papist anecdote. It's literally how tragic the thing can go, given the obvious hostility that existed, of course, between the Greeks and the Latins by the group of what had happened. Constantinople would become a great capital once again. Whatever. What I was saying is that the only few Westerners that at least after the disasters of Nicopolis and Varna, that were actually a major effort to get rid of the Ottomans in the early phase, were in fact Genoese, were Venetians, were all people that actually had possessions in Greece on their own private account, that understood that the loss of Constantinople would have caused major damage to all the Italian enterprises in the area. And of course, the Black Sea was the northeastern end of this broader space, which was, in a sense, easier to sweep out. The Ottomans basically emerged as a Western power. I mean, there is no doubt about this, even though there is all a style and a prestige and a sort of, even Mongol legacy among the various others, including the Roman one, it's even the papal one to a degree, like the tiara made for Suleiman The Magnificent speaks by itself, by the way. In a way, again, to try to win over the, as we just said, the locals mostly, depending on whom they were. Large part of Ottomans were Christians, notoriously, in their armies. Literally rose to power from, again, the Marmara Sea. It's literally a place that was Western since ever, right? And that remained so in a sense. They were a centralized power, right? As Machiavelli observed, while most Western powers were essentially feudal monarchies, doesn't matter how statal in nature they were surely developing like, Constantinople was the center of everything. It had a permanent professional military, we will see now. If you had knocked that out, he observed, you would have taken over the entire Turks' land, right? And it could have been feasible. At some point, the West had a chance, I don't know, after Lepanto or in other moments too, before, to knock out the Ottomans. Just it was a huge risk, and the Westerners were fragmented. They would become even more with the Reformation. And of course, the Ottomans were actually seen as a divine punishment for the latter. That was by far most magnitudinally impacting, event than the discovery, say, of the Americas. That in comparison was literally nothing. Right? What did you do today? Among the other things, and also probably at least one of the greatest tragedies in the history of mankind. And this, this was a problem for the Ottomans in turn as well, because in order to take out the Western, it was not a major Western power. So you had to go one by one, and as courageous and advanced as these powers were, everything was complicated. But you would cut the connections, at least with the Black Sea. And in order to finish off the local Christian colonies, you had, however, still to carry out some large strategic and logistical operations, including mounting up an adequate amphibious force, because you had to operate along the coast, and also with significantly stretched supply lines, because the Black Sea is huge, right? Not just holding Constantinople makes it easy to operate in places like the Azov Sea or whatever. So that these were taken out one by one. Right, the major force the Ottomans put together next to their rather feudal host of Sipais was the famous janissary. That is to say, the Ottoman, say the Sultan's own infantry, the Sultan's slaves, right, the new militia, the new host, right, the famous janissaries. I made videos about those, and we will keep making them for that matter. What is interesting about them is, of course, their cultistic, at some point even heretical, creed compared to the most orthodox Sunni one of the Sultan. Because, again, these were a bit like the crazy adoptive slave children of the Ottoman. They were, as you know, recruited through the, say, brutal practice of the Devshire method, especially, say, later on became literally, parents giving their children to the Ottomans because this would become so powerful that it would come back home at some point and endowing their parents with lands and so on. But in the 14th, in the 15th century was one of the single most radically brutal things you can imagine, with the Turks raiding, preying on the various children in the Balkan hinterland from this sturdy, robust and somehow, warlike and war-habituated, especially populations that had just crushed. We're talking about the Albanians, the Serbians, where they came. The Devshirme was practiced to a pretty large extent in different regions, telling the truth, but mostly the Balkans. And these children were selected from this young age to be, like a very small amount of them would become some courtier, basically administrators, bureaucrats, the most intellectually gifted. The others were instead to become professional soldiers, radically imbued with a single most fanatic military ideology imperial ideology you can imagine, drilled in this, again, incredibly abusive traumatic but incredibly effective, military order, for which these men literally acted. Like, there were different parts of this court that corresponded to the different, like, to all the actual tools and objects of the Sultan's house, like the big cauldron from which they all ate commonly. There was all this kind of cultic ideology revolving around the fact that they should have simply died for the Sultan in the first place. And they were quite effective. They were one of the few, and probably at that point largest force of, they counted in the thousands, professional, permanent force in Europe. Right, they had an astonishing collective training. They were able to perform maneuvers with an incredible order that deeply impressed the Western visitors. That, by the way, were mostly just the same Italians of before, because in the meanwhile, and thanks to them, we know basically almost what we know about the Ottomans, about the janissaries, is through these sources, because we do not really have like an Ottoman historiography. We know very, very few, right? Sometimes even just from the local Greeks than from properly the Turkish background, because it was an incredibly different mentality from the Western one. It was based on still a totalitarian sense of crystal order, of silence, of perennial discipline that was embodied at the Sublime Gate, and by the same janissary forces that represented like the actual deterrent capable of keeping down all the various timariotes of the empire, so the feudal nobility that, I mean, almost quasi-feudal, was something more similar to the Byzantine pronoia, given that it was in part also a continuation of the same. But at least the Sipai forces that considered them, of course, like lesser people because they were slaves, right? But in general, as we were saying, the order, right, the fact that already at this point, yes, surely the Ottomans were assisted by Western contractors. Think about Orban with the great bombard that killed this Hungarian-German contractor, had tried to sell this huge gun to the Saint Constantine the 11th, that however could not use it in defense of the Byzantine Emperor, in defense of the Saint Constantinople, because placing it on the Theodosian wall, the recoil of a single shot would have made them fall, just by itself. So there is all actually an important, again, a massive Western influence in the development of Ottoman warfare, but in these early days, in the 15th and 16th century, it's mostly like an incredibly innovative, advanced system. The granulation of powder, that is the single most important innovation in firearms technology before the introduction of the bayonet, so dominating European battlefields for 200 years, is to the Ottomans. There are very interesting things, like even developing of sniping weapons that were they had an incredible accuracy, up to 70 meters in the 16th century, the 15th century. This terrible Mediterranean sieges would take place with relentless stormtrooper tactics carried out by the janissaries, as we will see now, that operated as assault infantry together with bombardment, mining, and this alternate rhythm that is really reminiscent of World War I tactics. And that, again, is just like an entire chapter on its own in the annals of military history. The janissaries were also, like, people stress this aspect that they weren't very armored compared to the Westerners, and that Ottoman warfare in general was much lighter in nature, right? There were still lots of kind of steppes, horsemen coming from all this, also this area surrounding the Black Sea, etc., revolving around the hard core of the Ottoman army. In fact, with this infantry. But what we have to bear in mind is that the Ottoman forces had a great firepower, right? Actually, janissaries were tactically autonomous themselves. They had heavies on their own, very heavily armored troops that were just necessary for storming the enemy fortresses and things like that. But also they had a lot of guns, right? A lot of arquebuses, later muskets, that they operated as in concert. This sort of, again, constant fire pouring on the enemy lines, harassing them, admittedly lacking the level of stopping and power that especially the European infantries were starting having at this time, especially through pike and shot tactics. If anything, this is what the Ottomans lacked: the pikes, right? They didn't have strong stopping infantries like the pike squares of combined with heavy firearms, like acting in combination with the melee troops, right? Here the combination is rather between horse archers, skirmishers, and these gunners, right? And just a more contained amount of heavy infantry. Heavy cavalry was there, right? Western cavalry was credited with greater collective training than the feudal one of the Ottomans, but the latter individual Sipai was considered superior, right? And in part because the steppes influence had been surviving around in places like Anatolia, from this, again, the settlement of peoples from Central Asia, the Tartars in the north that were usually also mobilized by the Ottomans to harass the Poles, the Hungarians, etc. So this sense of wilder steppe, ethnic, exotic element surely lives on in history throughout these lands. Think about the Hussars, the Uhlans, the Dragons, all types of cavalry that would develop in a way or another from at least the need of coping, if not properly the origin from the steppes, right? And the way of fighting that had remained there is historical from quite a long time, right? If you compare the Ottomans to the Persians, you look at battles like the one of Calderan, you realize that the Ottomans looked more like a sort of pike and shot army of the Western type in comparison, because the Persians were still more feudal, chivalric minded, and they had much more injections directly from Central Asia, and then the European Turks. Let's just put it in this way. But definitely from a Western perspective, the Ottoman host looked like pretty exotic. The reason why also infantries were lighter and cavalry, probably at least in terms of number, right, is a bit compared to the Westerners, is a bit the same one. That lays at the difference between the steppes peoples and the sedentary ones. Even though, of course, the Ottomans were ultra sedentary in this period, they were a modern state. And the thing laying also in the different, in fact, nature of the West, the Western Europe compared to, say, for example, the Byzantine-controlled, the Byzantine area culturally, so the ones ruled over by the Ottomans, but a bit also Eastern Europe at the same time. That is to say, the West had more middle classes, right? It had a higher per capita wealth. It had, say, a greater level of advancement of interconnections, of centralization, so the means to drill, to train, to equip, to arm, and the sheer sense, again, also the sheer demographic power, still at the time, of course, the agricultural output was really enormous. So the Ottomans went on kind of trying eroding chunk by chunk that most, say, the powers that were more unbalanced towards, in fact, less centralized Western model. Hungary, we've made videos about that, was essentially a kingdom ruled just by the oligarchs, right? There had been effective rulers, but in practice it was always a clash against this local fief holders, right? Even some Italians like Pippo Spano, for example, were famously enough settling in places like, I don't know, in Serbia, or because again it was a bit like that Gazaria, right? It was a bit like that blend where there is no such thing like that the public civil institutional order that you're habituated to still in the contemporary world that emerged from the broader West. And the average people are poorer, right? There is simply a greater divide, a greater social stratification, even by the ancien regime standards that existed in Western Europe already from a couple of centuries, fundamentally for how at least we have known the ancien regime more typically in later times. And as a consequence, these people they can make up some local unprofessional militias at best, right? But they are so kind of living in wilder areas, more depopulated ones, areas that are also a huge frontier. The Ottomans inherited a great part of that had been the Byzantine one, right? A German burgher lived in a completely different situation, right? An Italian citizen lived in a completely different situation. Even a French peasant lived in a completely different situation, right? Where they were represented politically their own way, surely with different degrees of actual power owned. But if you read, for example, Machiavelli's description of the armament, the defense system of the German town militias, well, that's kind of impressive. There was nothing like that in the rest, let's say, of Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans. Consider again that the most advanced countries technologically at this point are Italy and Germany, right? And even though the Ottomans again top certain technologies, it's because they have literally they have an enormous empire that stretches from Ukraine to Sudan, from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, and can't concentrate an impressive amount of forces, but they do lack the socio-economical basis, properly the political institutional structure, to simply exploit like the normal emergence of certain estates locally. That it's just like a huge bureaucracy, a huge army, and then essentially a feudal world. That's it, right? The most active communities are essentially in the Aegean. It's basically a Greek legacy. They are the Greeks and the Jews, basically. Many Jews that were starting to go leaving the Ottoman Empire because it was, at least towards them, more tolerant than Christian Europe really was at some point. This is also debatable to a degree, but just to make the case, there were some Venetian merchants that would convert to Judaism because they would make even more money in the Ottoman Empire between a truce and another, at least between Venice and the Turks, than they would be as Christians, right? So this is really interesting. And they were writing home to their wives saying, why don't you convert to Judaism as well and come live with me in Constantinople? And this pious Catholic women, of course, refused because they thought better. Not, but just these are actual stories, extensively documented and very interesting to actually appreciate. So the janissaries introduced in the history of warfare great innovations as far as, for example, you can't really talk about them, but there were particularly uniforming clothes, for example, especially kaftans and caps. I made a video about properly the appearance of the janissary. Also, as you know, basically all the modern military musical bands use instruments that date back to that time. These are all things that in the modern age in Europe we copied from the Ottomans, and that were done initially as a bit of a sort of exoticism. Of course, the shots come out in especially in Central Europe, many places are filled with not just praise of war, right? in the ones against the Ottomans, but actual replicas, right? European princes were obsessed with full set of Ottoman armor, right, to donate to one another. And there was some interest, of course, from the Ottoman side towards the West too. However, to get down to the most brutal aspect of this, like, if you look at the varied panoply of a janissary, you could see sabers, knives, bows, later surely a gun, as we've seen, a yataghan, the splendid kind of curved sword that has spread. Say it already existed in some forms before, but it remained up there, even in colonial troops of the European armies up to very recently in time, still existing, I think, in some cases, in the tradition of the various units. There are very good weapons, naturally, for mounted warfare, right? And not only. I was talking about, yes, the fact that the Ottomans became famous, as we've seen, for gunpowder technology. But initially, they had some. They adopted that quite fast, and they topped it quite fast. But in the very, very beginnings, exactly in the 14th, 15th century, say up to the mid 15th century, they weren't immediately so convinced about it. Also, for it's always a political and social reason, but there was some ethical consideration. Again, for a Sipai, the Sipai is a bit like the chivalry, the Don Quixote of the situation. It's a feudal guy that looks at infantry and shooting with this kind of stinky things of the devil and says, well, these are barbarians, these are lesser ones. But again, a great power of the time could not be devoid of artillery capacity, especially one that wanted to take over successfully the entire Eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans. So terrible grounds with incredible logistical challenges, massive fortresses. Think about Belgrade, or at some point the Ottomans by the mid 15th century were about to be pushed back. Think about Hunyadi and Capistrano and Pius II, that all died basically at the same time, but that were essentially gathering forces to push the Ottomans back, even after the fall of Constantinople. So the Ottomans were tempered by these wars as well, against also pretty brave people. As you know, the Battle of Kosovo-Polja against the Serbians was a bloodbath. The same Ottoman Sultan died there. The Hungarians also were like a consistent threat to the same Ottomans, even though they were, to be the weaker side in general for a consistent amount of time. There were always, again, the Italian navies creating problems. There were alternate fortunes. Again, this is not the video in which to recollect all the various military episodes. Just the Ottoman advance was relentless, however, for the rhythms of the time, and threatening some of the greatest centers of Christianity. Right, the Ottomans wanted Rome for obvious reasons, but the West, still with all its divisions, with all its problems, with all its kind of myopic crisis to a point there, managed to stand its ground, and to eventually in the 17th to the 18th century probably turning the tides. There were, as we were saying before, not just heavy janissaries, but also mounted janissaries. There was, as far as light cavalry, is heavy cavalry. The Tartars, as we will see now, mostly provided large numbers of these morodeers, we can say, that just laid waste everything, or at least collected part of what was needed for the Ottoman army as well, creating a screen, right, a typical tactic of the steppes, right, used since, Magyar times. During the invasions of Germany, you find the same identical thing. What I would like to leave you with, as far as the series is concerned, is how continuous and how close the threat of, say, at least the influence, right, the action of steppes warfare really was for Western standards. As far as the armor of the Turkish knight, the Sipai, we can list mail coats, cuirasses, combined mail, lamellar armor, either pointed or low helmets, brassards, and greaves, right? So a full pack there of heaviness, concentrated with a Eastern steppe bias as well. Do not underestimate, by the way, Mamluk influence. When the Ottomans were rising, like, yes, they were very Byzantine influenced, very Western influenced, but also the really the major power around that was reaching in terms of military, cultural influence, the same abodes of the early Ottomans, was the massive Mamluk Sultanate, right? They're stretching from, again, there, essentially Ethiopia to Cilicia, to the same coast of southern Asia Minor, the entire Levant, right, parts of North Africa. So all things that the Ottomans would take for themselves at some point. These forces operated, as we were saying, in more traditional roles, closely supported by the lighter ones, horse archers, javeliners, whatever. There was plenty of those cavalries also in the Balkans, among the Europeans, the subjected peoples, that also were influenced in turn by the Ottoman styles, by this further injection of Tartars in the area. So, obviously becoming hybrid with that kind of military culture. And again, as we were saying before, the Stratiots themselves, or the Hussar, the Magyar Hussars that would influence later on the Polish, Lithuanian heavy cavalry, right? So all things that were just reswarming again. So consider the collapse of the Hungarian kingdom, even as such. It was yet another moment of massive public collapse, right? Again, it doesn't matter how privatized or oligarchic the system was, still it was kept together by a sense of state of some sort. Well, when this crumbled, where you have a huge frontier that, as you know, will become probably the battleground between the Habsburgs and the Turks, etc. Think about the Serbian Haiduks that were, paid for carrying out insurgents, guerrilla against the Ottomans, paid with Austrian and Venetian money, etc. So again, it's one of the most fascinating melange as far as even blade types, right? Some names that we find and fancy treatises at this point are available, right? This type of sword, this other, what are they? Where do they spread? Even just biologically, can we trace connections? How far away in this world of the steppes? Because again, the steppes is in Hungary, right? Up to Vladivostok, it's steppes, right? And those peoples there move that fast, as we've seen. They immediately smell the opportunity of ravaging European countries every time they were invaded by the formidable Ottoman host, and so they would join from far away. Now, a word for the Golden Horde here that I feel bad about because I still haven't made ever a video about it properly. It could be an idea for the regional series now, but I usually do Christian stuff. In any case, the Khanate had declined consistently during the 15th century. This has started to fall apart. That's how the Crimean Tartars emerged as essentially an independent khanate on its own. They were governed by the local dynasty, the Eurasian, that were sponsored in turn by the Ottomans, who revered these people because even though they were actually a mix of, rather than mostly Mongols, rather Turks, right, and other peoples that, as we've seen, inhabited Crimea and the interland. There was still a divide there between the coast and the Crimean interland by a degree, but that's the interesting reality that had emerged, attributed to this khanate still a huge respect. Formally, it was just a client state, right? It was almost, you can say a puppet state, but almost, considering the sheer enormity of the Ottoman Empire in comparison and the influence on it. That, of course, the same Tartars were not always happy on. But again, the fiction was maintained that these were somehow the heirs of the great Oceanic Mongol Empire. And so the Ottomans that recognized that because they had absorbed this from their Turkic background, from the sense that the Mongols had objectively taken over the Turkic steppes, right? And so that they were the real rulers there. It were, say, respected to the point of also integrating this polity into the bigger game, right? And it was particularly practical in nature as a choice because, as you understand, having a Islamic power that you can maneuver in a place like Crimea, with an increasing also Polish power in the area, like this general instability of the region, it became quite important. Right? Constantinople was importing grains from Ukraine in the same ways that it had been going on ever since the 7th century, at least in the largest amount before Egypt was lost. The connections with the Rus were still existing, even though in a rival sense now, rather, so that the Tartars, the southern, as we've seen, Turkic Mongol reality now had, at least as far as religion went, like switched, right, allegiance in part. I made a video compared to the Rus, right? I made at least the Golden Horde had been dominating most of the Rus, and so there was an antagonism now that had developed as well for that reason. But I made a video about the Lipka Tartars, the Tartars of effective Lithuania, as the name goes, but also that had been settling in Poland, etc., that had been moving throughout from this region exactly in these centuries because of all these upheavals, and had ended up strengthening the power of the Commonwealth, the general, say, possibility of mobilizing still this steppes peoples that eventually would settle down, but still for a consistent amount of time would at least inhabit areas that were a bit separated from the rest, when the Muslims were a bit desolated and could sow the settlement of these very different people. And it began to fight, in that case, with the Lipka Tartars, notoriously, with notorious and as fanatic pride of Polish allies, protectors, right? As they owed their stay there to the same king. The Ottomans tried to flatter them, to switch their side, and this wouldn't work, right? Just say that, and because the Tartars said, we are free in our land, right? We're not, instead with you, we would be under a tyranny, basically. That was their response as fellow Muslims to one another, right? So fellow Muslims that can, of course, quarter each other, on a regular basis when they encounter themselves on the battlefield. And again, it's again impossible at this point, even of course, if the descendants of these people remain, to understand that the traumatic level of sheer brutality that the lifestyle of a Tartar would entail in the first place, and so how absolutely normal cutting a person to pieces would be for these people on a regular basis, right? What do? Well, I have my cattle, I have, I respond to my clan, whatever, and every once in a while we go on expedition and we, exterminate those freaking bastards that want to invade our land, right? And that's part of the game. It's part of every good Tartar life, right? And that's how they had been living. I mean, the entire purpose of this decade, of tens of videos long series is to practically inculcate the concept that steppes warfare was not in part about this. It was exclusively defined in total by this, right? There was not another type of existence than this specific aspect, right? And so imagine to live in a world where that's the only thing that exists. You cannot, in fact, but they did. So this is worth remembering as far as also the importance that this apparently peripheral regions played in the history of Europe. Again, the Lipka Tatars made the difference for many countries, right there, and there's not much around that. And this passed through ferocious clashes in the steppes, privations, losses, hopes, faith, and everything that this life entailed is hanging on a very thin thread, considering the brutality of the times and the places, especially because, as I was saying before, say what we call improperly as modern Europe was emerging by now from the other side of the continent. In these places, you cannot really distinguish much of what was at this point from, say, medieval times. If not maybe for the fact you could be taken down by a gun rather than just, an arrow, right? But that's, in fact, still telling of, the general circumstances you could find yourself into compared to before. Now, the Golden Horde nobility, known as Murzas and Begs, as well as their men-at-arms, that were technically a bit like this concept as followers. Now they had become professionals, right? And so they were known as Ulans, which simply means servant. So it actually betrays like the term Mamluk, Gulam, etc. This kind of, which is the same etymology, by the way, of the former and the latter. The slave origin, the fact that in Islam, as we've seen with the janissaries, with so many others, the idea is that there is a much more enforced sense of subjugation, in as much as the personal destiny of the individual and its connection with the master gives. It's a form of feudalism, fundamentally. It speaks again of the aforementioned brutality of the steppes compared to the more courtly forms that existed in the West. And so a level, as we've seen, of personal brutalization that did not, that had kicked in with the general crisis that had occurred among the freemen of the steppes since basically the fall of the Indo-European ones to the Turkic ones, right? The idea that this waves, first the Turks, then the Mongols, had properly annihilated the sense that the possibility as it existed at the time of the Sakas, let's say, of a kind of a more, say, a freer or more autonomous estate, right, assigned next to the great warlords of Eurasia. These people were habituated to just depend on this greater rulers, obeying them, having almost this servile, in fact, this slave kind of complexion, we can say, that literally transfigured them as such, because this was also the principle, and that, however, gave them, say, a place to be. Right, this is maybe strange sounding, but notoriously the Mamluks, say in Egypt, where the slave soldiers were much more, say, worthy individuals in terms of actual price than actually the average freeman. So, of course, the difference between the two on paper was juridical to some extent that civilization could protect. But in this north, there's literally nothing there that exists again but the language of the saber, per se. And the Uhlans were impressive fighters. They were equipped with the finest specimens of defensive armor of the steppes. At this point, they usually originated from Turkey. It's kind of obvious the Ottomans had the best arms and armor in the region at that point, especially after they took out the Mamluks. There were these more ancestral, primitive, traditional, panoplies, of course, of Turco-Mongol origin, but times were gradually changing also for these people. Also, the offensive weapons were generally imported. The Crimean Khanate, however, produced definitely her own weapons. This was also that traditional, like locally, that even again the average horseman knew how to build a bow and arrows on its own, right? Literally, they were able to live in the wilderness, to at least for talking about the majority of the subjects of the Khanate. There are some exquisitely designed Crimean sabers that surely were calibrated in this sense to the finest level of butchery that you can achieve in the steppes. Most people there are unarmored, right? So there is a bit of an increase between the men at arms, even here, a sort of even Western kind of osmotic influence there that irregiments a bit more kind of the local political and social structures. But for the rest, again, they were pretty wild. The Crimean sabers were exported together with knives, bows, to places like Caucasus, Central Asia, Russia, the Rzeczpospolita, so the Poland and Lithuania, basically Moldavia, right? So the Crimeans found themselves in between. If you think about that, throughout this time, one side you still have some Italian colonies, you have the rising Ottoman Empire, you have powers like Poland, also the Eurasian, so the Muscovites consolidating. You have also that origin of the steppes, like just east of that, and so you're in between, also Persian influence, etc. That really stimulates your own rollout there, your compaction under the Ottoman sphere of influence, and so the possibility of being nurtured as a relatively updated military power, considering the potential of your local resources. So later times saw the production even of fine Crimean handguns, which also were exported abroad. So again, the interesting aspect of it, sure, there is some economical reason. It's not necessarily that they were just the best, so that it was just an elite export, right? Obviously, it was a matter of saying, these guys fought a lot, they preyed on other peoples, they looted, they again received all they were exposed to the best technology, and they had some of the most brutal lifestyles out there. So this made an interesting combination as far as the manufacture of these weapons was concerned. So this is more or less the world we're looking at now, and it's really brutal. It's I say it very often, I repeat it, even probably excessively, but it's impossible, I presume, again, to describe to which extent this is true, right? When you properly don't acknowledge how it could practically be for such from such a perspective like today's one, especially. My interest, of course, goes also towards the arms and armor of neighboring peoples, who we'll see at some other time. Today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.